The air in Lowndes County, Alabama, hung thick and wet, like a wool blanket soaked in August heat. Dawn had not yet broken over Magnolia Hill Plantation, but Delilah was already awake. She had been awake, truth be told, since long before the roosters began their morning chorus. Sleep had become a stranger to her in recent months, a luxury afforded only to those whose hearts were not constantly braced for the next cruelty. Her bare feet moved silently across the wooden floorboards of the kitchen house, a separate structure that sat 30 yards behind the main plantation home. The building was her domain, her kingdom of cast iron and fire, where she had ruled for nearly 2 decades. Here, among the hanging herbs and sacks of cornmeal, she was more than property. She was essential. She was the cook, and a good cook was worth her weight in silver to a man like Master Edmund Thornhill. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the kitchen windows as Delilah began her daily ritual. First, the fire. She knelt before the massive hearth that dominated the eastern wall, arranging kindling with practiced precision. The wood was dry. She had learned long ago to keep a supply sheltered from the frequent rains that turned the red Alabama clay into a sea of mud. She struck the flint once, twice, and a small flame caught hold, growing steadily as she fed it larger pieces of oak and hickory. The fire's golden light began to fill the kitchen, casting dancing shadows across the rows of copper pots hanging from iron hooks. Delilah stood, brushing ash from her calloused hands, and allowed herself a moment to look at her reflection in the bottom of a polished pan. The face that stared back at her was 43 years old, though it might have been mistaken for older. Deep lines carved the corners of her eyes and mouth, lines etched not by laughter, but by the kind of weariness that settles into bone and sinew. Her hair, shot through with premature grey, was wrapped tightly in a blue cloth she had dyed herself using indigo stolen in careful pinches over the course of a year. But her eyes still held fire. She had inherited those eyes from her grandmother, a woman born free in Charleston before being kidnapped and sold south. Her grandmother had taught her many things during the brief years they had shared before the old woman's death. She had taught her which plants could heal and which could harm. She had taught her songs in a language that predated the chains, songs that spoke of ancestors who walked with spirits and commanded the wind. Most importantly, she had taught her that survival sometimes required patience, and that patience was not the same as surrender. Delilah moved to the work table and began preparing the morning meal. Biscuits first. Master Thornhill expected fresh biscuits with his breakfast, slathered in butter and honey. She mixed flour, lard, and buttermilk with mechanical efficiency, her hands working independently of her troubled mind. Her thoughts were elsewhere, always elsewhere these days. They were with Jonas, her son, her only child. The boy she had birthed in the corner of this very kitchen 17 years ago, during a thunderstorm so violent it had knocked loose 2 shutters and flooded the root cellar. He had come into this world screaming his defiance at the lightning, and she had loved him with an intensity that frightened her. In a world where children could be sold away on a master's whim, where a mother's love was considered irrelevant to the economics of human property, she had committed the dangerous act of letting her heart attach itself completely to another person. Jonas worked in the fields now, had for 3 years since his 14th birthday, when Master Thornhill decided he was old enough for harder labor. Before that, he had helped Delilah in the kitchen, learning to cook and preserve food, his quick mind absorbing everything she taught him. He had her eyes, that same fire, and his father's strong shoulders. His father, Samuel, who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi 6 years ago, a transaction Delilah had been powerless to prevent. She pressed the biscuit dough harder than necessary, her jaw clenched. The memory of Samuel's face as they loaded him onto the wagon still visited her at night, his eyes finding hers across the distance, silently begging her to be strong, to protect their son. She had failed at the first task. She had not been strong. She had fallen to her knees in the dirt and wailed like a wounded animal until her voice gave out. But the second task, protecting Jonas, that she had accomplished through sheer force of will and careful strategy. She had made herself indispensable. She had cooked meals so exquisite that Master Thornhill boasted about his table to every visitor. She had learned his preferences, his moods, the precise temperature he preferred his morning coffee. She had smiled when required, remained invisible when preferred, and never ever given him reason to notice Jonas as anything other than another field hand among dozens. Until 3 days ago, the memory made her hands still over the dough. 3 days ago, Master Thornhill's nephew, Charles, had accused Jonas of theft. A silver spoon had gone missing from the main house, an ornate piece that had belonged to the master's late wife. Charles claimed he saw Jonas near the dining room earlier that day, saw him lingering where he had no business being. It was a lie. Delilah knew it was a lie with the same certainty she knew the sun would rise. Jonas had been helping her carry vegetables from the garden that afternoon. He had been nowhere near the main house, but the truth held no currency here, not when weighed against the word of a white man, even one as dissolute and debt-ridden as Charles Thornhill. Master Thornhill had not bothered with questions or investigation. By evening, Jonas was dragged to the whipping post behind the smokehouse, a gnarled oak stump where countless backs had been broken and spirits crushed. Delilah had been in the kitchen when she heard the first crack of the whip splitting air and flesh. She dropped the knife she had been using to cut okra and ran to the window, her heart a wild creature throwing itself against her ribs. She could not see the post from her window, but she did not need to. Each crack of the whip transmitted through the thick summer air like thunder. After the third strike, she heard Jonas cry out, a sound that would be carved into her memory until her dying day. A mother knows her child's voice in all its variations, joy, fear, pain. This was agony given breath. Her hand had moved to the door handle, her body operating on instinct to go to him, to throw herself between the whip and her son. But Rosa, one of the house slaves, had appeared as if conjured, grabbing Delilah's arm with surprising strength. "Don't," Rosa had whispered urgently. "You go out there now. You'll just make it worse for him, maybe worse for you both." Delilah had stood frozen, her body trembling with the effort of restraint, while the whip fell again and again. She counted 15 strikes before the sound stopped. 15 pieces of her heart carved away. They had left Jonas tied to the post until after dark, as was Master Thornhill's custom, a warning to others, a body displayed like a flag of dominion. When they finally cut him down, Delilah had been allowed to tend to him. She had cleaned his wounds with water and salt, applied poultices made from comfrey and yarrow, and sung to him the old songs her grandmother had taught her. His back was a landscape of destroyed flesh, some wounds so deep she could see the white of bone beneath. "Mama," he had whispered through cracked lips, his voice barely audible. "I didn't take nothing. I swear before God, I didn't take nothing." "I know, baby," she had replied, tears streaming down her face. "I know you didn't." But knowing changed nothing. Jonas lay on his stomach in the small cabin they shared with 3 other families, his breathing shallow and labored. Fever had set in yesterday. She recognized the signs, the dry heat radiating from his skin, the occasional delirium when he called out for his father or spoke in fragments of dreams. The wounds were festering despite her best efforts. She had seen it before, knew where it led. Her son was dying because of a lie about a silver spoon. The biscuits were in the oven now, the kitchen filled with the yeasty smell of baking bread. Delilah moved mechanically through the remaining breakfast preparations. She fried thick slices of ham, cooked eggs in bacon grease, prepared grits with butter and cream. The Thornhill family would eat well this morning, as they did every morning, their plates heavy with food while the people who produced that food survived on scraps and cornmeal. As she worked, her eyes kept drifting to the shelf above the dry goods cabinet. There, hidden behind a tin of imported tea Master Thornhill favoured, was a small leather pouch. Inside that pouch were seeds, oleander seeds, specifically, dried and crushed into a fine powder. Her grandmother had given them to her years ago, along with detailed instructions on their use and properties. "These seeds," her grandmother had said, holding the pouch up to the light, "they come from a beautiful flower. White and pink and sweet-smelling, but inside them is death, a pinch smaller than a pea, mixed in food or drink, and a man's heart will seize up like a fist. He'll be dead before the meal is finished, and no doctor will know why. They'll say it was his heart, a natural passing, but you'll know different." Delilah had tucked the pouch away, never intending to use it. It was insurance, nothing more, a desperate option for the most desperate of circumstances. She had carried it from cabin to cabin over the years, had buried it once when the overseers conducted a search for contraband, had even considered throwing it away entirely, but she never had. The breakfast was ready. Delilah arranged everything on the serving trays with practiced precision. Ham sliced at precise angles, eggs positioned just so, biscuits arranged in a cloth-lined basket. She called for Lily, one of the house girls, to carry the trays to the dining room. As Lily disappeared through the door with the laden trays, Delilah stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up. Through the window, she could see the first fingers of sunlight reaching across the cotton fields, illuminating rows that stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, men and women were already moving toward those fields, their bodies stiff from inadequate sleep on hard wooden pallets, their stomachs rumbling with hunger that would not be satisfied until evening. And in the cabin she shared with others, Jonas lay dying. Delilah closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of stillness. In that moment, she was not the head cook of Magnolia Hill Plantation. She was not property valued at $800 according to Master Thornhill's ledger. She was simply a mother whose child had been brutalized for a crime he did not commit, in a world that offered her no recourse, no justice, no hope. She opened her eyes and looked again at the shelf where the leather pouch waited. Not yet, not today, but soon, perhaps. Soon. The morning progressed as mornings always did. Delilah prepared the noon meal. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, peach cobbler made from fruit she had preserved the previous summer. Master Thornhill ate on the veranda, fanning himself against the oppressive heat while discussing cotton prices with his overseer, a cruel-faced man named Jessup, who took particular pleasure in his work. Through the kitchen window, Delilah watched them, her hands never ceasing their work. She saw Master Thornhill laugh at something Jessup said, saw him drain his glass of sweet tea and hold it out for more. A man without a care in the world, satiated and comfortable, his belly full of food her hands had prepared. That afternoon, she was finally granted permission to leave her duties early to check on Jonas. She hurried to the cabin, her heart hammering with fear at what she might find. Inside, the air was stifling and thick with the smell of sickness. Jonas lay exactly as she had left him that morning, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin burned with fever. "Mama," he whispered when he sensed her presence. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." She bathed his face with cool water, changed his bandages, tried to get him to drink broth she had smuggled from the kitchen. He managed only a few sips before his head lolled to the side, unconscious again. Sarah, an older woman who shared the cabin, touched Delilah's shoulder gently. "He's in God's hands now," she said softly. "Ain't nothing more you can do but pray." Delilah nodded, unable to speak past the grief lodged in her throat like a stone. She sat with Jonas until the evening bell rang, signaling she was needed back in the kitchen to prepare supper. She kissed her son's burning forehead and forced herself to walk away, though every instinct screamed at her to stay. The kitchen felt different when she returned to it that evening. The familiar space seemed charged with possibility, with potential. Delilah lit the lamps and began preparing the evening meal. Master Thornhill had guests coming, a planter from the neighboring county and his wife. The meal needed to be impressive. She prepared beef stew, rich and thick with vegetables. She made fresh bread. She prepared roasted potatoes with herbs. And she poured Master Thornhill's bourbon, expensive Kentucky whiskey he kept in a crystal decanter, into his favorite glass. As she worked, her hands moved to the shelf above the dry goods cabinet. Her fingers found the leather pouch. She held it for a long moment, feeling its weight, feeling the weight of the decision it represented. Not tonight. The guests complicated things, but soon, very soon. She returned the pouch to its hiding place and finished preparing the meal. Lily and another housegirl, Ada, carried the dishes to the dining room. Through the walls, Delilah could hear the sounds of conversation and laughter, the clink of silverware against fine china, the privileged ease of people who had never known a moment's suffering that was not of their own making. She cleaned the kitchen, banking the fire for the night, washing pots and pans until they gleamed. By the time she finished, it was fully dark outside. She was exhausted, her body aching from the long day's labor, but she could not rest. She had to check on Jonas again. The walk to the cabin felt longer than usual. The night air was thick and still, heavy with the promise of rain. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flickered across the horizon without sound. Heat lightning, they called it, though Delilah had never understood why. The night insects sang their endless song, a chorus that had provided the soundtrack to her entire life. She reached the cabin and pushed open the door, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior, lit only by a single candle. Sarah sat beside Jonas, her hand resting on his shoulder. When she looked up at Delilah, her face told the story before her words could. "He ain't got long," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe hours, maybe less." Delilah crossed the small space and knelt beside her son. His breathing had become ragged, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a defeat. His eyes were closed, his face slack. She took his hand in hers, it was still burning with fever, and brought it to her lips. "Jonas," she whispered. "Baby, I'm here. Mama's here." His eyelids fluttered but did not open. A small sound escaped his throat, neither word nor moan, just sound, the last protests of a body giving up its hold on life. Delilah felt something inside her chest crack open, a fissure that split wide and deep. She had known grief before, when her mother died, when Samuel was sold away, when her daughter was stillborn years before Jonas came. But this was different. This was watching the only good thing she had managed to protect in this cruel world slip away from her, powerless to stop it. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to him, her tears falling onto their joined hands. "I'm so sorry, baby. I should have protected you. I should have done something." Sarah moved quietly to give them privacy. Delilah sat with Jonas through the night, holding his hand, singing to him softly, telling him stories of his father, of his grandmother, of ancestors who had been free and proud. She told him about a world beyond this one, a place where there were no masters and no chains, where a man could stand tall and unafraid. As dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Jonas took 3 final shuddering breaths. Then he was still. Delilah did not cry out. She did not wail or scream as she had when Samuel was taken. Instead, she sat in perfect silence, still holding her son's cooling hand, watching as the light grew stronger outside and the plantation began to wake for another day. Sarah returned and touched her shoulder. "Delilah, you got to let him go now. You got to get to the kitchen before they come looking." Delilah nodded slowly. She laid Jonas's hand across his chest, closed his eyes with gentle fingers, and kissed his forehead one last time. Then she stood, straightened her dress, and walked out into the morning. The kitchen was exactly as she had left it the night before. The fire had burned down to embers in the hearth. Pots hung from their hooks in orderly rows. The floor was swept clean, everything in its place, everything as it should be, as if the world had not just ended. Delilah stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at this space that had been both her prison and her kingdom for 20 years. Her hands had prepared thousands of meals here. Her feet had worn smooth paths in the wooden floorboards. Her tears had fallen onto this work table more times than she could count, quickly wiped away before anyone could see. This kitchen knew her better than any person alive. She moved to the hearth and began rebuilding the fire. Her hands performed the familiar task automatically, while her mind existed somewhere else entirely, somewhere beyond thought or feeling, in a grey space where nothing mattered and everything mattered too much. Jonas was dead. Her son, her baby, the child she had birthed and nursed and raised and loved with every fibre of her being, gone. Dead because of a lie about a silver spoon. Dead because in this world his life had never held value in the first place. Dead because she had failed to protect him. The fire caught and grew. Delilah stood before it, watching the flames dance and twist. She thought about the fire that her grandmother had spoken of, the fire that lived in the blood of their people, the fire that could not be extinguished, no matter how many chains they forged, how many whips they cracked, how many children they stole and sold and murdered. That fire was burning in her now, hotter than the flames in the hearth, more consuming than any blaze she had ever tended. She began preparing breakfast with mechanical precision. Biscuits, ham, eggs, grits. The same meal she had prepared yesterday and would prepare tomorrow and the day after that, as if continuity of routine could somehow mask the fundamental break that had occurred in the fabric of her world. Lily arrived to help with the serving, her eyes red-rimmed. "Delilah, I heard about Jonas. I'm so sorry. He was—" "Don't," Delilah said quietly, not looking up from the eggs she was frying. "Don't say nothing. Not now." Lily nodded and busied herself with setting the trays. They worked in silence, the only sounds the sizzle of food in pans and the morning songs of birds outside the window, birds who knew nothing of justice or injustice, of love or loss, who simply sang because that was their nature. Master Thornhill ate his breakfast on the veranda again, reading a newspaper that had arrived from Mobile. Delilah watched him through the window, as she had countless times before, but today she really saw him, studied him the way a hunter studies prey, noting details she had previously dismissed as irrelevant. He was 56 years old, she knew, though he looked older. Years of rich food and whiskey had thickened his middle and reddened his nose. His hair, once dark, had gone mostly grey. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to dominion over other human beings, who had inherited wealth and position and saw both as natural as breathing. He had ordered Jonas whipped. He had stood and watched while his son's back was destroyed. And now he sat reading his newspaper, eating biscuits her hands had made, completely untroubled by the death his cruelty had caused. The morning passed. Delilah prepared the noon meal. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, her body present but her mind elsewhere, calculating, planning, remembering her grandmother's instructions about the oleander seeds. "A pinch smaller than a pea," her grandmother had said. "Mix it in something strong-flavored that will mask any bitterness. Stew is good. Bourbon is better." Master Thornhill drank bourbon every evening with his supper, Kentucky whiskey, aged 12 years, smooth and expensive. He was proud of his collection, boasted about it to visitors. Every night, without fail, he poured himself exactly 3 fingers in a crystal glass and sipped it slowly while he ate. Delilah cleaned the kitchen after the noon meal, her movements automatic, her mind far away. Sarah found her there in the early afternoon, standing at the work table with her hands braced against the wood, staring at nothing. "They're going to bury him tonight," Sarah said softly. After dark, in the plot past the south field. Reverend Paul is going to say words over him. Delilah nodded, but did not speak. There was nothing to say. They would put Jonas in the ground with dozens of others who had died on this plantation, marked only by wooden crosses that would rot away within a few years, leaving no trace that they had ever existed. Their lives and deaths both unmemorable, unimportant, unrecorded, except perhaps in Master Thornhill's ledger, as a financial loss. "You want me to stay with you?" Sarah asked. "Help with supper preparation?" "No," Delilah said quietly. "I need to be alone tonight. I need to think." Sarah looked at her for a long moment, her dark eyes filled with understanding and perhaps a hint of concern. Then she nodded and left, closing the kitchen door softly behind her. Delilah stood in the silent kitchen, listening to her own heartbeat, feeling the weight of decisions settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She walked to the shelf above the dry goods cabinet and retrieved the leather pouch. She held it in her palm, feeling its modest weight, thinking about everything it represented. Her grandmother had given her this choice years ago, had armed her with knowledge and means, had trusted her to know when and if to use it. That moment had arrived. Jonas's death had clarified everything, had stripped away all the accommodations and compromises she had made to survive, had revealed the simple truth underneath. There was no justice for people like her, except the justice they took for themselves. She opened the pouch and looked at the powder inside, fine and pale, innocuous in appearance, deadly in application. Her grandmother had told her stories of their ancestors, of women who had used poison to resist enslavement, who had chosen death for themselves and their oppressors rather than accept bondage. They had been called murderers. History, written by those who had survived them, remembered them as villains, but Delilah understood them now in a way she never had before. They had not been villains. They had been mothers and daughters and wives who had reached the limit of endurance, who had looked at an unjust world and decided that if they could not change it, they could at least make their oppressors pay for their cruelty. She tied the pouch closed and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, against her heart. Then she began preparing the evening meal with more care and attention than she had given any meal before. Master Thornhill had no guests tonight. It would be a simple family supper, just him, his nephew Charles, and his sister Margaret, who managed the household. Simple was good. Simple reduced complications. Delilah prepared beef stew, rich and thick, flavored with onions and carrots and potatoes. She added bay leaves and black pepper and salt. She let it simmer for hours, the smell filling the kitchen with a false promise of comfort and nourishment. She made cornbread, golden and steaming. She prepared greens with bacon fat. And she poured bourbon into Master Thornhill's crystal glass. Her hand hesitated over the glass, the leather pouch in her other hand. This was the moment. Once she added the powder, there would be no going back. She would have crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She thought about Jonas's face when they cut him down from the whipping post, about his fevered whispers, about the way his hand had felt in hers as he died. She thought about Samuel, sold away, about her stillborn daughter, about her mother who had worked herself to death in these fields, about her grandmother who had been kidnapped into slavery. She thought about the countless people who had suffered and died on this land, whose pain had fed Master Thornhill's wealth, whose lives had been considered less valuable than livestock. Her hand stopped shaking. She opened the pouch, measured out a small amount of powder, less than a pea, just as her grandmother had instructed, and tipped it into the bourbon. The powder dissolved immediately, leaving no trace, no evidence of its presence. The whiskey looked exactly as it always did, amber and clear, promising warmth and comfort. Delilah set the glass on the serving tray alongside the covered dishes of food. Her heart was beating hard, but her hands were steady. She felt strangely calm, as if she had already passed through some barrier and existed now in a place beyond fear or doubt. Lily came to collect the trays. Delilah watched her carry them toward the main house, watched the girl's careful steps, the slight sway of the tray as she navigated the uneven ground between the kitchen and the veranda where Master Thornhill waited. Then there was nothing to do but wait. Delilah cleaned the kitchen, washing pots and pans, wiping down surfaces, sweeping the floor. She worked slowly, methodically, aware that these might be her last moments in this place, her last moments of freedom such as it was. If the poison was discovered, if anyone suspected, she would be hanged or worse. She knew this. She had accepted this. Some things were worth dying for. Through the window she could see the main house, its windows glowing with lamplight. She could hear the faint sounds of conversation and cutlery. Master Thornhill was eating his supper, drinking his bourbon, completely unaware that his last meal was being served. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Delilah stood at the window, her hands gripping the sill, hardly daring to breathe. Then she heard it, a shout from the house, followed by the crash of something heavy falling. More shouts, confused and frightened. Lily burst through the kitchen door, her eyes wide with panic. "Delilah! Master Thornhill, he just collapsed, fell right face first into his plate. They're calling for the doctor, but he ain't moving, he ain't breathing. Oh, Lord, I think he's dead." Delilah turned from the window to face the girl. Her expression was calm, almost serene. "Go back to the house," she said quietly. "Help where you can. I'll be along directly." Lily hesitated, then ran back toward the main house where chaos was erupting. Delilah could hear more shouting now, could see people running, could sense the panic spreading like wildfire through the plantation. She walked to the hearth and stood before the fire, the same fire she had tended every day for 20 years, the same fire that had cooked every meal Master Thornhill had eaten in that time. The flames danced and flickered, casting shifting shadows across the kitchen walls. "For Jonas," she whispered to the fire. "For Samuel. For Mama and Grandmother and all the others. For every person who suffered under his hand and had no recourse. Let this be justice, even if history calls it murder." The door burst open, and Jessup, the overseer, stood in the threshold, his face twisted with rage and suspicion. Behind him, she could see other men gathering, carrying torches, their faces ugly with mob fury. "You!" Jessup snarled, pointing at her. "What did you do? What did you put in his food?" Delilah looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes. She felt no fear, only a strange sense of completion, of a circle closing. She had done what needed to be done. Her son's death had been answered. Whether that answer would cost her own life mattered less than the fact that it had been given. "I gave him exactly what he deserved," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the space between them. "I served him justice." They dragged her from the kitchen into the yard, rough hands gripping her arms hard enough to bruise. Delilah did not resist. She walked with dignity, her head held high, her expression calm. Around her, the plantation had descended into chaos. Slaves stood in small clusters, watching with fearful eyes. White faces from the main house peered out of windows. Dogs barked in the distance, sensing the disturbance. Jessup shoved her toward the whipping post where Jonas had been tied just days before. The rope that had held her son still hung from the gnarled oak, a dark reminder of cruelty. Delilah looked at it and felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, but recognition. This was where it would end, in the same place her son's suffering had begun. "Tie her up," Jessup ordered, his voice shaking with rage. Two men moved forward to comply, but a voice from the main house stopped them. "Wait!" Charles Thornhill stumbled down the veranda steps, his face pale and slack with shock. "My uncle, the doctor says his heart just stopped. No warning, no previous condition, just stopped." "She poisoned him!" Jessup shouted, pointing at Delilah. "Look at her! She as good as admitted it." "I served him justice," Delilah repeated, her voice steady and clear. "For my son, who he murdered over a lie, for a silver spoon that Jonas never touched." Charles' face went even paler. He exchanged glances with several other men, and in that moment, Delilah saw something flicker in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition. She understood then with sudden clarity. Charles knew Jonas had been innocent. Charles had lied about seeing him near the dining room. But why? Margaret Thornhill appeared on the veranda, her black dress rustling as she descended the steps. The master's sister was 53 years old, unmarried, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued. She had managed the household for decades, had kept the books and supervised the house slaves and maintained order in her brother's domain. She looked at Delilah with an expression that was difficult to read. "Charles," she said coldly, "tell them the truth. Now." "Aunt Margaret, I don't know what—" "The truth!" Her voice cracked like a whip. "About the spoon, about Jonas. Tell them what really happened." Charles's face crumpled. He looked suddenly very young, despite his 32 years, like a boy caught in a shameful act. "I took it," he whispered. "The spoon. I had gambling debts, you see, and I thought I could sell it without anyone noticing. When Uncle Edmund discovered it missing, I panicked. I said I saw the slave boy, Jonas, near the dining room. I thought he would just get a few lashes and that would be the end of it. I didn't know Uncle Edmund would—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. A murmur ran through the assembled slaves. Delilah felt her knees weaken, but she remained standing, her eyes fixed on Charles with an intensity that made him flinch and look away. "You killed my son," she said quietly, "over a silver spoon and your gambling debts. You lied, and my son died." "I'm sorry," Charles stammered. "I never meant— I didn't think—" "No," Delilah said, "you didn't think. You didn't think his life mattered. You didn't think a mother's love mattered. You didn't think consequences applied to you." Margaret Thornhill descended the remaining steps and crossed the yard to stand before Delilah. She studied the cook's face for a long moment, and something like understanding passed between them. Two women who had spent their lives in servitude of different kinds, who had both learned that justice in this world was reserved for those with power. "Did you poison my brother?" Margaret asked, her voice low enough that only Delilah could hear. "I gave him what he earned," Delilah replied. "I cooked his meals for 20 years, fed him, nourished him, kept him healthy and satisfied. And he took my son from me over a lie. He took the only thing in this world I loved. So yes, ma'am, I put oleander in his bourbon. I watched him drink it, and I don't regret it." Margaret nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. She turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "My brother died of heart failure," she announced in a clear, carrying voice. "The doctor has confirmed it. A natural death, if sudden. As for Charles's confession regarding Jonas—" She turned to look at her nephew with undisguised contempt. "You will leave this plantation tonight. Do not return. Your inheritance is forfeit." "But Aunt Margaret, tonight," she repeated coldly. "Be grateful I don't have you arrested for theft and bearing false witness that led to a man's death, though perhaps I should. Perhaps I will." Charles opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and fled toward the main house. The crowd watched him go in stunned silence. Margaret turned back to Delilah. "As for you," she said, still speaking quietly enough that only those immediately nearby could hear, "you're a murderer by law. I should have you hanged or turned over to the authorities. That would be justice according to those who write the laws." "Then do it," Delilah said simply. "I'm ready. I've been ready since the moment Jonas died." Margaret studied her face for another long moment. Then she turned to Jessup and the other men. "Untie her. She's to be locked in the smokehouse until I decide what to do with her." "But ma'am," Jessup protested. "Do as I say," Margaret snapped, "or you'll be looking for employment elsewhere." They released Delilah's arms reluctantly. Two men escorted her to the smokehouse, a small brick structure at the edge of the property where meat was cured and stored. They pushed her inside and barred the door from outside. Delilah found herself in darkness, surrounded by the smell of smoke and salt and hanging meat. She sank down against the wall, her body finally allowing itself to feel the exhaustion and grief she had been holding at bay. In the darkness, she let the tears come. Tears for Jonas, for Samuel, for the life she had imagined for her son that would never be, for the price she knew she would ultimately pay for her act of resistance. But even through the grief, she felt no regret. She had answered cruelty with justice. She had made the master pay for his sins. Whether history would remember her as a murderer or a mother protecting her child mattered less than the fact that she had refused to accept injustice silently. Hours passed. Night fell completely. Through the cracks in the smokehouse walls, Delilah could see torchlight moving in the distance. They were burying Jonas, she realized, laying him to rest in the unmarked plot where so many others had gone before him. She pressed her hands against the wall and sang softly, the old songs her grandmother had taught her, sending them out into the night to find her son's spirit and guide him home to ancestors who would welcome him. Sometime after midnight, she heard the bar on the door being lifted. The door opened and Margaret Thornhill stood in the opening, holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows across her severe face. "Come with me," Margaret said quietly. Delilah rose stiffly and followed the older woman out of the smokehouse. She expected to be led toward the main house, perhaps to face some formal judgment or to be turned over to authorities. Instead, Margaret led her toward the edge of the property, toward the woods that bordered the cotton fields. They walked in silence until they reached the tree line. Margaret stopped and turned to face Delilah, the lantern casting strange shadows that made her face appear younger or perhaps older, ageless, timeless, the face of every woman who had ever had to make impossible choices. "I loved my brother," Margaret said quietly, "but I was not blind to his cruelty. I kept his books. I knew how many people died on this plantation, how many children were sold away, how many families were destroyed. I told myself it was the natural order of things, that it was not my place to question or intervene. I was wrong." Delilah said nothing, waiting. "Jonas was innocent," Margaret continued. "Charles confessed as much. My brother had him whipped to death over a lie, over a piece of silver that Charles stole. That is murder by any reasonable definition. You answered murder with murder. I cannot condone what you did, but I cannot condemn it either, not when I understand why you did it." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small leather bag. "There's money in here, not much, but enough to get you started somewhere else. There's also food and a map showing safe houses, people who helped runaways reach the north." Delilah stared at her, not quite understanding. "You're letting me go?" "I'm opening a door," Margaret said. "What you do with it is your choice. You can walk through it and try to make a new life somewhere beyond the reach of this place and its laws. Or you can stay and face whatever justice the courts would dispense, which we both know would be swift and brutal. The choice is yours." "Why?" Delilah asked. "Why would you help me after what I did?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Because I am tired," she said simply. "Tired of pretending this system is just or righteous. Tired of watching people suffer and telling myself there is nothing I can do. Tired of being complicit in cruelty. My brother is dead. Nothing will bring him back. Hanging you will not bring Jonas back either. It will simply be more death, more suffering, more grief. I'm too old and too tired for more death." She pressed the bag into Delilah's hands. "Go. Now, before Jessup or anyone else realizes what I'm doing. Follow the North Star. There are people who will help you if you can reach them. And if you make it to freedom, live. Live for Jonas, for all those who didn't make it. Live and remember them." Delilah took the bag, her fingers closing around it. She looked at Margaret Thornhill, this white woman who had spent her life benefiting from slavery, who was now opening a door to freedom, and felt something complicated unfurl in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition of shared humanity in a system designed to deny it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Margaret said. "Just go, and be careful. They will look for you when they discover you're gone. They will hunt you. Trust no one, unless they prove they can be trusted." Delilah nodded. She turned toward the woods, then paused and looked back. "The oleander seeds," she said. "My grandmother told me they came from a beautiful flower, white and pink and sweet-smelling, but deadly inside. I used to think that was a metaphor for something. Now I think it was just the truth. Beautiful things can be deadly. Deadly things can be beautiful. Justice and murder. Sometimes they're the same action, just viewed from different angles." "Perhaps," Margaret said. "Or perhaps we simply live in a world where the moral certainties we've been taught are lies, and the truth is far more complicated and painful than we want to acknowledge. Go now, before I lose my nerve." Delilah stepped into the woods and began to walk. Behind her she heard Margaret return toward the plantation, the lantern light fading. Ahead, the trees rose dark and dense, offering concealment but also danger. Somewhere beyond them lay the possibility of freedom, though she knew the journey would be long and treacherous. She thought about Jonas as she walked, about his face the last time she had seen him alive, about all the dreams she had harbored for him. Those dreams were dead now. But she was alive, and in her survival was a kind of victory, a refusal to be destroyed by the same system that had taken her son. The woods grew thicker. Delilah moved carefully, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, her ears alert for sounds of pursuit. She did not know if she would make it to freedom. She did not know if Margaret's moment of conscience would hold when morning came and questions were asked. She did not know what lay ahead. But she knew what lay behind. Grief and injustice and a small act of defiance that would ripple outward in ways she could not predict or control. She had poisoned the master. She had served justice with a side of bourbon, and whether history would remember her as a murderer or a mother pushed beyond endurance, she had made her choice and would live with its consequences. The North Star shone through gaps in the trees above. Delilah oriented herself and kept walking, putting distance between herself and Magnolia Hill Plantation, between herself and the only life she had known, walking toward an uncertain future, but walking nonetheless. Behind her, the plantation slept, unaware that in the morning they would find the smokehouse empty and the cook gone. Some would say she ran from justice, others would say she ran toward it. And in the years to come, a story would grow around that night, a story of a mother's love and a mother's vengeance, of a poisoned meal and a death that some called murder and others called righteous judgment. 3 days after fleeing Magnolia Hill, Delilah stood at the edge of a swamp somewhere in northern Alabama, her feet bleeding through the rags she had wrapped around them, her body trembling with exhaustion and hunger. The money Margaret had given her was already half gone, spent on a ride in a farmer's wagon that had taken her 30 miles north before the farmer grew suspicious and left her at a crossroads. The map Margaret had provided showed safe houses marked with small X's, but reaching them meant traveling through open country where a black woman alone would draw immediate suspicion. She'd walked mostly at night, sleeping during the day in whatever shelter she could find, abandoned barns, hollow trees, dense thickets. She ate berries and roots she recognized from her grandmother's teachings, drank from streams, and kept moving north. The swamp before her now was not marked on the map. She could go around it, adding at least another day to her journey, or she could try to cross it, risking the water moccasins and alligators she knew lived in such places. Every hour she delayed increased the chance of being caught. By now, Jessup would have organized search parties. Slave catchers with dogs would be combing the countryside, motivated by the reward that would surely be offered for her capture. She chose the swamp. The water was warm and dark, stinking of decay and growth in equal measure. Delilah waded in carefully, testing each step before committing her weight, using a long stick to probe ahead for hidden depths or dangerous creatures. The water reached her knees, then her waist, soaking her dress and making each movement difficult. Mosquitoes swarmed around her face. Something brushed against her leg and she froze, her heart hammering, but it was only a fish or floating debris. It took her 3 hours to cross the swamp. By the time she reached solid ground on the far side, the sun was rising and she was too exhausted to go further. She found a dense stand of cattails and collapsed among them, hidden from view, and fell into a sleep that was closer to unconsciousness. She woke to voices. Tracked her this far. Dogs lost the scent at the swamp edge. She went through it then. Stupid wench. Probably drowned or got eaten. Maybe, but we should circle around, pick up the trail on the far side if we can. Delilah lay perfectly still, barely breathing, while the men, 3 of them by the sound of it, discussed their search. She recognized one voice as Jessup's. The others were probably professional slave catchers, men who made their living hunting down runaways. "I still say it's a waste of time," one of the strangers said. "She killed a white man. They're gonna hang her soon as we bring her back. Why not just assume the swamp got her and collect half the reward?" "Because I want to see her hang," Jessup said, his voice thick with venom. "She murdered Master Thornhill, poisoned him like a coward. She deserves to suffer for it." "Murder!" the other voice scoffed. "From what I heard, the master had her boy whipped to death over something he didn't do. Seems like justice to me, not murder." "You watch your mouth," Jessup snapped. "That kind of talk will get you in trouble. The law is clear. A slave who kills a master hangs, doesn't matter what the reason was." They moved away, their voices fading. Delilah waited until she could no longer hear them, then waited longer still, counting slowly to 1,000 before she dared to move. When she finally emerged from the cattails, the sun was high overhead and the men were nowhere to be seen. She continued north, moving more cautiously now, aware that the search was active and organized. The map showed the nearest safe house to be 15 miles away, in a town called Fletcher's Mill. If she could reach it, if the people there were truly willing to help, she might have a chance. The day passed in a blur of walking and hiding, of fear and exhaustion. Her feet left bloody prints on the dirt road she crossed. Her dress was torn and filthy. She looked like what she was, a runaway, desperate and dangerous. Any white person who saw her would know immediately what she was fleeing from. As evening approached, she spotted a small cabin in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney. She was so hungry, so thirsty, so tired that she almost approached it despite knowing the risk. But something made her pause and observe from a distance instead. A white woman emerged from the cabin, calling children inside for supper. 3 children, all young, all fair-haired. A normal family living a normal life, probably struggling like most poor whites in Alabama, probably not particularly concerned with the moral question of slavery one way or another. Delilah turned away and kept walking. She could not risk approaching strangers, could not trust anyone whose motivations she did not understand. Better to keep moving, to stay hungry, to survive on her own resources until she reached the safe house that might or might not exist. Night fell. The map showed she was close to Fletcher's Mill now, perhaps 5 miles away. She allowed herself a moment of hope. Dangerous, fragile, but impossible to suppress entirely. If she could reach the safe house tonight, if the people there were willing to help, if the next link in the underground chain held strong, then perhaps she might actually make it to freedom. The road she followed entered a stretch of forest, dark and close. Delilah moved carefully, her senses alert for danger. The night sounds were different here, owl calls and rustling leaves and the distant howl of what might have been a wolf or might have been dogs. Dogs. The thought made her move faster, caution giving way to panic. If they had brought tracking dogs around the swamp and picked up her trail, they could be hours or minutes behind her. She had no way of knowing. She broke into a run, stumbling over roots and rocks in the darkness, her breath coming in gasps, her body screaming for rest that she could not afford to give it. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in from all sides, threatening to trap her forever in their shadows. Then suddenly she burst out of the trees into a cleared area. Ahead, she saw lights, a small town, houses scattered along a main street, the dark bulk of a mill beside a stream, Fletcher's Mill. Delilah paused at the edge of the trees, trying to orient herself. The map showed the safe house as being on the north edge of town, marked with a specific symbol, a house with a red door. She searched the distant buildings but could see no red door from this angle. She would have to enter the town. After dark, a black woman alone, looking like a runaway. It was possibly the most dangerous thing she could do. But she had no choice. She could not survive much longer on her own. She needed help, and this was where the map said help could be found. Delilah pulled the remnants of her head wrap down to better conceal her face, took a deep breath, and began walking toward the town. She moved quickly, but tried not to appear frantic, tried to project the demeanor of someone on legitimate business, despite her disheveled appearance. The main street was quiet. A few people moved between buildings, but no one paid her particular attention. She kept her eyes down and kept walking, searching for the red door. Most houses were dark or lit dimly from within. She passed a general store, a blacksmith's shop closed for the night, a small church with a white steeple. Then she saw it. At the far end of the street, a modest house set back from the road, its door painted a deep red that was visible even in the dim light from a nearby lamp-post. Relief flooded through her so intensely she nearly stumbled. She approached the house carefully, looking around to make sure she was not observed. The windows showed no light from within. She knocked softly on the red door, then waited, her heart hammering. Nothing. She knocked again, slightly louder, still nothing. Fear began to replace hope. What if this was the wrong house? What if the people who had lived here and helped runaways had moved away or been discovered? What if Margaret's information was old and unreliable? She was raising her hand to knock a third time when the door opened a crack. A face appeared in the gap, a white man, middle-aged, with sharp eyes that assessed her quickly and thoroughly. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Delilah said quietly, using the phrase Margaret had told her to say. "I'm looking for a friend who quilts. I heard she lives on this street." The man's expression did not change. "We don't know any quilters here," he said, starting to close the door. "Please," Delilah said desperately. "I was told she makes a pattern with stars, a special pattern that points north." The door stopped closing. The man studied her face for another long moment, then opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." Delilah slipped inside, and the man shut the door behind her, dropping a bar across it. They stood in a dark hallway. The man lit a small lamp, keeping the wick turned low, and the weak light revealed a spare but clean interior. "I'm Samuel Green," the man said quietly, "and you're running from something. The question is what and why." "My name is Delilah," she said. "I ran from Magnolia Hill Plantation in Lowndes County. There was trouble there. The master died, and they blame me for it. I had a map that showed this house as a safe place, but I don't know if—" "Magnolia Hill," Samuel interrupted. "Edmund Thornhill's plantation. I heard about that. Word travels fast when a prominent planter dies suddenly. They're saying it was his heart, but they're also saying one of his slaves disappeared the same night, a cook. They're offering $200 for her capture." Delilah's heart sank. $200 was a fortune. Even people sympathetic to runaways might be tempted by such a sum. Samuel saw her expression and shook his head. "I don't care about the reward. I'm a Quaker, Miss Delilah. I believe slavery is a sin, and those who participate in it will answer to God. If you're running from that place, I'll help you if I can, but I need to know the truth. Did you kill Edmund Thornhill?" Delilah met his eyes directly. "Yes," she said. "I poisoned him. He had my son whipped to death over a lie. Over a silver spoon the master's nephew stole. Jonas was 17 years old and innocent, and they destroyed him. So I put oleander in the master's bourbon and watched him die. If that makes me a murderer, then I'm a murderer. But it felt like justice to me." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I can't say I wouldn't have done the same in your position. Come, you need food and rest. My wife Rachel is upstairs with our daughters. We'll get you cleaned up and fed. Then we need to move you quickly. If they've offered $200, every bounty hunter in 3 states will be looking for you." He led her through the house to a small kitchen, where he set out bread, cheese, and cold chicken. Delilah ate ravenously, her body desperate for sustenance. While she ate, Samuel explained the situation. "Fletcher's Mill is not safe for you to stay. Too many people come through here, too much traffic. We need to get you to the next station, a farm about 40 miles north, run by a family named Patterson. They have better facilities for hiding people and more experience with longer-term concealment. I have a wagon and can drive you there. But we need to leave before dawn. The roads will be watched during the day." "Why are you helping me?" Delilah asked. "You don't know me. For all you know, I'm dangerous." "You're a mother who lost her child to injustice," Samuel said simply. "And you're a human being seeking freedom. That's all I need to know. My faith teaches me that all people are equal in God's eyes, that slavery is an abomination, and that it's my duty to help those fleeing from bondage. Whether you poisoned a man or not, well, I believe in a higher law than the laws written by men who buy and sell other human beings." A woman appeared in the doorway, Rachel Green, Samuel's wife, a thin woman with kind eyes. "I've prepared the hiding place," she said, "and I found some clean clothes that should fit you. Come, let's get you bathed and changed before the journey." Delilah followed Rachel upstairs to a small washroom where a basin of warm water waited. She cleaned herself as best she could, washing away days of swamp mud and exhaustion, watching the water turn brown and murky. Rachel gave her a simple dress, worn but clean, and a warm shawl. "You're very brave," Rachel said softly. "What you did, I don't know if I could have done it, but I understand why you did." "I don't feel brave," Delilah admitted. "I feel like I'm running from a storm that's always right behind me, about to catch up." "Then we'll help you stay ahead of it," Rachel said, "for as long as we can." They returned downstairs where Samuel was loading supplies into a wagon, food, blankets, a rifle in case of trouble. He had constructed a false bottom in the wagon bed, a narrow space where Delilah could hide if they encountered patrols or checkpoints. "We leave in 2 hours," Samuel said, "before dawn, but after the midnight patrol passes through. Rachel will keep watch while you rest. You'll need your strength for the journey ahead." Delilah nodded. She was beyond exhaustion, but she lay down on a pallet Samuel had prepared and closed her eyes, trying to quiet her racing mind. She thought about Jonas, about whether he would approve of what she had done, of the choice she had made to flee rather than stay and face execution. She thought about Margaret Thornhill, whose unexpected mercy had given her this chance. She thought about Samuel and Rachel Green, these white strangers who were risking their own safety to help her reach freedom. The world, she realized, was more complicated than the simple divisions of slave and master, black and white, guilty and innocent. There were gradations, nuances, people who defied easy categorization. Samuel and Rachel were white, but they fought against slavery. Margaret had benefited from slavery her entire life, but had opened the door to Delilah's escape. Charles had condemned an innocent boy to death through his lies, yet his confession had revealed a truth that complicated the simple narrative of justice and retribution. And Delilah herself, was she a murderer or a mother seeking justice? Was she a criminal fleeing lawful punishment or a victim fighting back against an unjust system? The answer, she suspected, depended on who was telling the story and from what vantage point they viewed her actions. "Delilah," Samuel's quiet voice broke into her thoughts. "It's time." She rose and followed him outside where the wagon waited in the darkness. Samuel helped her into the hidden compartment beneath the wagon bed. It was cramped and dark and smelled of hay, but it was also safe, invisible to casual inspection. "God willing, we'll have you at the Patterson farm before noon," Samuel said. Try to stay quiet if you can. I'll knock 3 times on the boards if it's safe to come out. If you hear anything else, stay hidden no matter what." The boards closed over her, and darkness enveloped her completely. She heard Samuel climb onto the wagon seat, heard the horses being urged forward, felt the wagon begin to move. Hidden beneath the false bottom, surrounded by darkness, Delilah began the next leg of her journey toward a freedom she could barely imagine, but was willing to risk everything to reach. Above her, the stars wheeled across the sky, indifferent to human suffering and human courage alike, marking the passage of time and the slow turning of the world toward dawn. The journey to the Patterson farm took 6 hours. 6 hours of cramped darkness, of breathing stale air, of listening to the wagon wheels creak and groan over rutted roads. Twice, Samuel stopped and spoke to other travelers. Delilah held her breath during these encounters, her body rigid with fear. But each time, Samuel's calm voice explained he was transporting supplies, and the wagon rolled on unmolested. When the 3 knocks finally came, and Samuel lifted the boards, sunlight streamed in blindingly bright. Delilah climbed out stiffly, her muscles cramped from the long confinement. They had arrived at a substantial farm, fields of corn stretching to the horizon, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a 2-story farmhouse painted white with green shutters. A man emerged from the house, tall and lean, with a weather-beaten face and calloused hands that spoke of hard labor. "Samuel," he greeted, then turned to Delilah. "You must be the woman Margaret Thornhill sent word about. I'm Jacob Patterson. You're safe here, for now at least." "You knew I was coming?" Delilah asked, surprised. "Margaret sent a telegram to a contact in Mobile, who sent word north through our network," Jacob explained. "We've been expecting you for 2 days. Started to worry you hadn't made it. Come inside. My wife Helen has food ready." The farmhouse interior was spacious and well kept. Helen Patterson, a sturdy woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense manner, ushered Delilah to a table laden with food: eggs, ham, biscuits, fresh milk. Delilah ate while Helen and Jacob explained the situation. "You can't stay here long," Jacob said. "Maybe a week, 2 at most. The slave catchers are getting more aggressive, more organized. They know the routes we use, the safe houses. We've had 2 near misses in the past month. But we have a place where you can hide while we arrange the next leg of your journey. It's not comfortable, but it's secure." He led her to the barn and showed her a hidden room built into the hayloft, accessible only through a concealed door, ventilated through carefully disguised openings, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Inside was a narrow bed, a water bucket, some books, and a small lamp. "You'll stay here during the day," Jacob explained. "At night, when it's safe, you can come to the house, walk around a bit, get some fresh air. But during daylight hours, you need to be invisible. We have neighbors who don't know about our activities and need to keep it that way." Delilah nodded, understanding the precarious position these people were putting themselves in to help her. If discovered, the Pattersons would face serious legal consequences, fines, imprisonment, possibly worse. "Why do you do this?" she asked Jacob. "Risk so much for strangers." "Because it's right," he said simply. "My father owned slaves when I was young. I watched what it did to people, both the enslaved and the enslavers, saw how it corrupted everyone it touched, turned human beings into property, kindness into cruelty. When I inherited the farm, I freed everyone my father had owned, and I swore I'd spend the rest of my life fighting against the institution that had poisoned my childhood. Helen feels the same. We can't change the whole system, but we can help individuals escape it. That's something, at least." The days at the Patterson farm fell into a rhythm. Delilah spent her days in the hidden room, reading the books Jacob provided, mostly religious texts and abolitionist literature, but also some novels and poetry. She had learned to read from Samuel, who had taught Jonas in secret despite the laws forbidding it. Reading had always been an escape for her, a window into worlds beyond the plantation. Now it was also a way to pass the long, confined hours. At night she would emerge and help Helen with kitchen work, finding comfort in the familiar tasks of cooking and preserving food. They talked while they worked, about the growing tensions between North and South, about the abolition movement, about the complex network of people helping slaves escape to freedom. "There are more of us than you might think," Helen told her one evening as they canned tomatoes. "Quakers, yes, but also Methodists, free blacks, former slaves who made it north and came back to help others, even some white Southerners who've grown disgusted with slavery. We're connected through churches, through business relationships, through letters written in code. It's dangerous work, but it's necessary work." On the 5th night of her stay, Jacob came to the hidden room with news. "We've arranged the next stage," he said. "There's a conductor coming tomorrow night, a free black man named William who's made the journey north dozens of times. He'll take you to Cincinnati. From there, you'll have options. You can continue to Canada, where you'll be completely beyond the reach of American law, or you can stay in Cincinnati, where there's a strong, free black community and plenty of work for someone with your skills." "Canada," Delilah said immediately. "I won't feel safe until I'm beyond their reach entirely." Jacob nodded. "That's probably wise. William will get you to Cincinnati, and from there another conductor will take you across Lake Erie into Canada. With luck and God's grace, you could be free within 2 weeks." But that night luck ran out. Delilah was in the hidden room, preparing for sleep, when she heard the dogs. The sound was distant at first, but growing closer, the deep baying of tracking hounds on a scent. Her blood turned to ice. They had found her trail somehow, tracked her to the farm. Rapid footsteps on the ladder, and Jacob appeared, his face pale. "Slave catchers," he said urgently. "Must be a dozen men, maybe more. They have dogs and they're surrounding the property. Helen's going to meet them, try to delay them while I get you out through the escape tunnel. Escape tunnel? Under the barn, leads to the creek about 200 yards away. Come on, we don't have much time." He led her down from the loft to a section of floor that lifted away to reveal a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. It was completely dark, the walls close and suffocating. "Follow it straight," Jacob said. "Don't turn, don't stop. It comes out in the creek bank, hidden by willow trees. Cross the creek and head north. There's an old church 5 miles from here, abandoned, but the structure's still sound. Hide there until tomorrow night, then William will find you. He knows the place. What about you and Helen? We'll be fine. They have no proof we're harboring anyone. Now go." Delilah dropped into the tunnel and began crawling. The darkness was absolute, the air close and damp. Behind her, she heard Jacob replace the floorboards, heard his footsteps moving away. Then, more distantly, the sound of men's voices raised in anger, Helen's voice responding calmly, dogs barking frantically. She crawled faster, her hands and knees scraping against packed dirt and rocks. The tunnel seemed endless, claustrophobic, a grave she had buried herself in. Her breath came in gasps, panic rising in her throat, but she forced herself to keep moving. Then suddenly, the tunnel opened out, and she was tumbling into water, the creek cold and fast-moving. She surfaced gasping, oriented herself, and began wading downstream, using the water to mask her scent from the dogs. The willow trees Jacob had mentioned were visible in the moonlight, their branches hanging low over the water. Behind her, she heard shouting, heard the dogs baying louder. They had discovered the tunnel. She had minutes at most before they reached the creek. Delilah climbed out of the water and ran. She ran like she had run from Magnolia Hill, like she had run through the swamp, her body finding reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The abandoned church was 5 miles away. She had to reach it before dawn, had to disappear before the slave catchers spread out to search the area. The night seemed endless. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, then walked until she could run again, driven by fear and desperate hope. The dogs' baying grew fainter, but never entirely disappeared. They were still hunting, still searching. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, she saw it, A small wooden church, its white paint peeling, its steeple tilting slightly to one side, sitting alone in an overgrown clearing. She approached cautiously, checking to make sure she was not observed, then slipped inside through a broken door. The interior was dim and musty, pews covered in dust, the altar bare. Birds had nested in the rafters. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls, creating patterns of light and shadow across the floor. It was abandoned and decrepit, but it was shelter. Delilah found a space behind the altar where she would be hidden from casual view and collapsed, her body shaking with exhaustion. She had escaped again, but barely. The slave catchers were closer than ever, more determined, better organized. How many more times could she slip through their fingers before her luck ran out? She thought about Jonas, about whether he would want her to keep running, to keep fighting. She thought about the price others were paying to help her. Samuel and Rachel, Jacob and Helen, all risking their own safety for her freedom. She thought about the long journey still ahead, the risks still to be taken, the uncertain future waiting in Canada if she could reach it. Sleep took her before she could resolve these thoughts into anything coherent. She dreamed of Jonas as a child, laughing and playing in the plantation gardens before the world taught him that his joy was not permitted. She dreamed of Samuel, her lost love, and wondered if she would ever see him again or if slavery had swallowed him entirely. She dreamed of fire and poison and justice served in a crystal glass. When she woke, the sun was setting, and someone was moving in the church. Delilah pressed herself against the wall behind the altar, hardly breathing, listening to footsteps approaching. A man appeared, black, middle-aged, wearing worn traveling clothes and carrying a pack. He looked around the church interior, his eyes sharp and assessing, then spoke quietly. "The creek runs fast, but the willow trees provide shelter. You can come out. I'm William, and I'm here to take you north." Delilah emerged from her hiding place, studying him carefully. "Jacob Patterson sent you?" "He did, and he sent his apologies for last night's trouble. The slave catchers raided his farm but found nothing. They searched for hours, tore apart his barn, questioned him and Helen, but they had no proof and eventually had to leave. Jacob and Helen are fine, though they'll be watched closely for a while." Relief flooded through Delilah. "I was so worried I'd gotten them arrested." "They knew the risks," William said. "We all do. Now come on, we need to move." "I have a wagon hidden a mile from here. We'll travel by night, sleep by day, take back roads and avoid main routes. With any luck, we'll be in Cincinnati in 4 days. From there, another conductor will take you across the lake to Canada. You'll be free, Miss Delilah, truly free." Free. The word seemed impossible, a concept so foreign after 43 years of bondage that she could barely comprehend it. What did freedom mean? What did it feel like? She would find out if she survived the journey. They left the church as darkness fell, William leading the way through forest and field to where he had hidden the wagon, a modest farm cart pulled by a sturdy horse. The wagon had a false bottom similar to the one Samuel had used, and Delilah climbed into it as William explained the journey ahead. "We'll move slowly, carefully," he said. "I know every safe house between here and Cincinnati, every conductor, every route. I've made this journey 47 times and never lost a passenger. Don't intend to start now." As the wagon began to move, carrying her north through the darkness toward freedom and an unknown future, Delilah allowed herself to hope. She thought about the kitchen at Magnolia Hill where she had made the decision to poison Master Thornhill, about the moment her hand had stopped shaking and steadied with purpose. That decision had set her on this path, fleeing, running, surviving against all odds. Some would call her a murderer. History might remember her as a criminal. But she knew the truth. She had served justice the only way available to her in a system that recognized her as property rather than a human being with rights and dignity. She had answered cruelty with defiance, oppression with resistance. And now, carried through the night by a man who had dedicated his life to helping others escape bondage, she was becoming something new. Not a slave, not property, but a free woman claiming her own destiny, writing her own story, living for herself and for the son who would never see freedom, but whose memory drove her forward. The wagon rolled on, and Delilah closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of the wheels, letting herself drift toward sleep and dreams of a life beyond chains. Cincinnati rose before them on the 8th day of their journey, a city of brick buildings and church spires sitting on the banks of the Ohio River that marked the boundary between slave territory and freedom. William had guided them skillfully, avoiding patrols and suspicion, sleeping in safe houses and hidden barns, always moving forward, always north. "That's it," William said, pointing across the river to the northern shore. "That's Ohio, free soil. Once you cross that water, you're beyond the reach of Alabama law. They can't legally force you back." But Delilah had learned that legal and actual were different things. There were still bounty hunters who crossed into free states, still kidnappers who grabbed black people and dragged them south, still a fugitive slave law that made even northern freedom precarious. Only Canada would truly put her beyond reach. They stayed in Cincinnati for 3 days, while William arranged the final leg of the journey. During that time, Delilah experienced her first taste of what freedom might mean. She walked on public streets without fear, spoke to people without lowering her eyes, entered shops where she was treated as a customer rather than property. The free black community in Cincinnati was substantial and organized. Churches, businesses, mutual aid societies, all working together to build lives of dignity and independence. A woman named Martha, who ran a boarding house for fugitive slaves passing through, took Delilah under her wing. "You got skills," Martha said, after watching Delilah help prepare a meal. "Real cooking skills. You could make a good living in Canada, either working for someone else or starting your own business. There's opportunity up there, real opportunity, for those willing to work for it." "I've always worked," Delilah said quietly. "Just never got paid for it, never got to choose what work I did or who I did it for." "That's about to change," Martha said firmly. "Williams arranged for a conductor named Sarah to take you across Lake Erie tomorrow night. She runs a boarding house in Toronto, helps newcomers get established. You'll have a place to stay until you find work and get on your feet. It won't be easy, nothing ever is, but it'll be yours. Your life, your choices, your future." That night, Delilah stood at the window of Martha's boarding house and looked out over Cincinnati. Gas lamps lit the streets below. People moved freely, going about their business, their lives ordered by choice rather than compulsion. Somewhere across that river and beyond the lake that lay further north, her future waited. She thought about the past that had brought her here, about Jonas and Samuel, about her mother and grandmother, about all the people she had loved and lost to slavery's cruelty. She thought about the moment she had added poison to Master Thornhill's bourbon, the moment her life had irrevocably changed. She had murdered a man. That fact would follow her always, a weight she would carry forever. But she had also claimed agency in a world designed to deny her any. She had refused to accept her son's death as something to be borne silently. She had acted, knowing the consequences, choosing justice over safety. That decision had set her on this path toward freedom, and though the price had been high, she could not entirely regret it. The following evening, Sarah arrived, a white woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a determined manner. "I have a boat waiting," she said. "The crossing will take most of the night. Lake Erie is unpredictable this time of year, but the weather looks favorable. Are you ready?" Delilah looked at William, the man who had guided her safely north, who had risked his own freedom repeatedly to help others find theirs. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." "Thank Jacob and Helen," William replied. "Thank Samuel and Rachel. Thank all the people who helped you get here. And when you're established in Canada, if you can, find ways to help others like I've helped you." That's how the chain stays strong. Each person who makes it through helps the next person coming behind them. The boat was a small sailing vessel, designed for cargo, but adapted for human transport. Delilah and two other fugitives, a young couple barely out of their teens, crowded into the small cabin below deck, while Sarah handled the rigging above. As the boat pulled away from the dock and into the lake's dark waters, Delilah felt the past slipping away behind her with each yard of distance. The crossing was rough. The lake threw waves against the boat's sides, cold spray coming through gaps in the deck above, the vessel pitching and rolling in ways that made Delilah's stomach rebel. But Sarah proved to be a skilled sailor, and as dawn broke over the water, a shoreline appeared in the distance. The Canadian shore, the final destination, the end of the journey. They landed at a small dock outside Toronto as the sun rose fully. Sarah helped them ashore, then led them to her boarding house, a large building in a working-class neighborhood where several other black refugees lived. She showed Delilah to a small but clean room on the second floor. "This is yours, for as long as you need it," Sarah said. "Meals are provided, and I'll help you find work when you're ready. Welcome to Canada, Miss Delilah. You're free now. Truly, completely free." Delilah stood alone in the small room after Sarah left, looking around at the simple furniture, the clean bed, the window overlooking a street where people moved freely and without fear. She was 43 years old. She had spent her entire life as property, as slave, as someone whose existence had value only in terms of labor and economics. Now, suddenly, impossibly, she was something else. She was free. The word felt strange, heavy with meaning she was still learning to understand. What did freedom mean practically? What did it feel like day to day? She would discover these answers gradually, she supposed, as she built a new life in this new place. That afternoon, Sarah took her to the market district to begin learning the city. As they walked, Delilah marveled at the diversity around her. Black people and white people moving together in the streets, some freeborn, some former slaves like herself, all sharing the same public spaces without the rigid hierarchies she had known her entire life. "It's not perfect here," Sarah cautioned. "There's still prejudice, still discrimination, but it's different from what you knew in Alabama. Here, you have legal rights. You can own property, sign contracts, testify in court. You're a person under the law, not property." Over the following weeks, Delilah began to build a new life. She found work cooking at a restaurant that catered to Toronto's growing black community. The owner, a free black man named Thomas, who had escaped slavery in Virginia 15 years earlier, recognized her skills immediately. "You cook like someone who learned from tradition," he said, after tasting her food. "Real soul in your cooking. That's rare and valuable. I can pay you fair wages, more if business is good. Wages, payment for labor." The concept was so foreign that Delilah struggled to grasp it at first. But when Thomas handed her her first week's pay, actual money, hers to keep and spend as she chose, she felt something shift inside her. This was what freedom meant in practical terms: ownership of her own labor, choice about how to spend her time and money, agency over the direction of her life. She saved her money carefully, planning for the future. She made friends among the other refugees and free black residents of Toronto. She attended a church where former slaves gathered to support each other and remember those still in bondage. And slowly, gradually, she began to heal from the trauma that had driven her north. But Jonas was never far from her thoughts. At night, she dreamed of him, sometimes as the child he had been, sometimes as the young man he had become, sometimes as a ghost, watching over her with those same fire-bright eyes she had given him. She talked to him in her mind, telling him about her new life, about the freedom he had never lived to experience. 6 months after arriving in Toronto, Delilah received a letter forwarded through the underground network. It was from Margaret Thornhill, written in a careful hand. Dear Delilah, I write to inform you that the plantation has been sold. After my brother's death and the scandal that followed, I could not continue maintaining the place. The slaves have been dispersed to other properties, though I arranged for several families to be kept together where possible. Charles left Alabama and has not been heard from since. His confession regarding Jonas caused quite a stir locally, though most chose to forget about it quickly. Such inconvenient truths rarely survive long when they threaten comfortable assumptions. I hope this letter finds you well and safe. I do not expect forgiveness for my years of complicity in the system that harmed you and your son. But I want you to know that your courage, both in what you did and in your escape, changed something in me. I have donated a significant portion of the plantation sale proceeds to abolitionist causes. It is inadequate compensation for a lifetime of injustice, but it is what I can offer. I think of Jonas often, and of you. I hope you have found peace. Margaret Thornhill. Delilah read the letter several times, feeling complicated emotions she couldn't quite name. Margaret's gesture was meaningful, but could never balance the scales of justice. Nothing could bring Jonas back. Nothing could restore the years of bondage, the families separated, the countless cruelties, large and small, that had marked her life before freedom. But perhaps that was the nature of justice in an unjust world. Imperfect, incomplete, always falling short of what was truly owed. 1 year after arriving in Canada, Delilah stood in the kitchen of her own restaurant. She had saved enough to rent a small space, had hired 2 other former slaves to help her, and had built a reputation for excellent food that drew customers from across Toronto. The restaurant was modest but successful, and it was entirely hers. As she worked, preparing dishes that combined traditional Southern cooking with new recipes she was developing, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had killed a man. She had fled justice as defined by the laws of Alabama. She had survived against odds that should have destroyed her, and she had arrived here in this place, building something new from the ashes of her old life. Some nights, when the restaurant was closed and she sat alone in the kitchen, she could still smell the phantom scent of Magnolia Hill, wood smoke and magnolia blossoms, and the bitter tang of oleander. The past never fully released its hold. She still woke sometimes from nightmares of whips and chains, still flinched when men raised their voices, still carried grief for her son like a stone in her chest. But she was free. She was building a life on her own terms, and every meal she cooked, every dollar she earned, every choice she made about her own future was a small act of resistance against the system that had tried to define her as less than human. On the anniversary of Jonas's death, Delilah closed the restaurant and attended a memorial service at her church. She stood with others who had lost children to slavery's brutality, and she spoke Jonas's name aloud, making sure he was remembered. "My son Jonas," she said to the gathered congregation, 17 years old when they killed him over a lie. He was innocent and good, and he deserved to live a free life. I carry his memory with me every day, and I live the freedom he never had in his honor. Others shared similar stories. Children sold away, families torn apart, loved ones worked to death or beaten or hanged. The stories were almost unbearable in their accumulated weight of grief and injustice, but there was also strength in the sharing, in the collective refusal to let these lives be forgotten, to let their deaths be meaningless. After the service, an older man approached Delilah. He had a familiar look, sharp eyes, strong shoulders, and when he spoke, her heart nearly stopped. "Delilah," he said quietly, "is it really you?" It was Samuel. Her Samuel, Jonas's father, the man she thought she had lost forever when he was sold to Mississippi 12 years before. He had escaped 2 years after being sold, had made his way north through the same underground network that had helped her, had been living in Toronto for nearly a decade. They stood looking at each other, both struggling to process the impossibility of this reunion. Then They were embracing, tears streaming down both their faces, years of separation and grief collapsing into this single moment of connection. "Jonas," Samuel asked when they finally pulled apart, "where is our son?" And Delilah had to tell him, had to watch her husband's face collapse as she described Jonas's death, the false accusation, the whipping, the poison she had used to avenge him. Samuel listened in silence, his hands gripping hers tightly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You did right," he said when she finished. "You answered injustice with justice. I only wish I had been there, wish I could have protected him, protected you both." "We're here now," Delilah said. "We survived. We're free. That's what Jonas would have wanted for us, to survive, to be free, to live." Over the following months, Delilah and Samuel rebuilt their life together. Samuel had found work as a carpenter and had saved money for years. Combined with Delilah's restaurant profits, they had enough to buy a small house, their own property, their own home, something that would have been impossible in Alabama. They married again, this time in a ceremony of their choosing, with friends and community surrounding them. They hung a photograph of Jonas above the mantel, keeping his memory alive in their home and hearts. And they dedicated themselves to helping other refugees arriving in Toronto, offering employment, housing assistance, and the knowledge they had gained from their own journeys. 5 years after arriving in Canada, Delilah stood in the kitchen of her expanded restaurant, teaching a group of newly arrived refugees how to cook. She was 48 years old, her hair fully grey now, her hands marked by years of work, but finally working for herself rather than a master. Through the window, she could see Samuel outside, building an addition to their house. They had taken in 3 orphaned children over the years, children of slaves who had died during the escape north, and were raising them as their own, giving them the freedom and opportunities Jonas had never had. It was not the life Delilah had imagined during her years at Magnolia Hill. It was not what she had dreamed when she sang to Jonas as a child, hoping he might somehow escape the chains that bound them both. But it was a good life, a free life, built on choices she had made and sacrifices she had accepted. She still thought about that night in the kitchen at Magnolia Hill, about the moment she added poison to Master Thornhill's bourbon. She had murdered a man. That truth would never change, and she carried the weight of it always. But she had also claimed her own humanity in a system designed to deny it. She had refused to accept her son's death as something to be borne in silence. She had acted knowing the price, choosing justice over submission. Some called it murder. History might remember her as a criminal if it remembered her at all. But Delilah knew what it was, a mother's love transformed into action, a desperate grasp for justice in a world that offered none, a refusal to let cruelty go unanswered. And standing in her own kitchen, in her own restaurant, in a country where she was recognized as a human being with rights and dignity, she could not entirely regret the choice she had made. It had cost her everything, and had also given her everything. Freedom, agency, a life of her own making. Outside, children played in the street, both black and white, their laughter rising into the summer air. Samuel hammered at his construction, building shelter and safety with his own hands. Former slaves and freeborn black residents moved through the neighborhood, working their own jobs, living their own lives, creating a community of survival and mutual support. Delilah watched all of this through her kitchen window and felt something that had been absent for most of her life: hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope of her plantation years, but something stronger and more enduring. Hope grounded in the tangible reality of freedom, in the daily choices she made about her own life, in the future she was building for the children she had taken in. She turned back to the stove where dinner was cooking, a meal she would serve to her family, in her own home, bought with money she had earned. The kitchen smelled of herbs and roasting meat and fresh bread, wholesome scents that held no hint of poison or bitterness. She had killed a man and fled justice as Alabama defined it. She had poisoned her master and watched him die. She had served what she knew to be right in a world that declared it wrong. And she had survived to build a life worth living, free from chains, answerable only to herself and to the memory of the son she had loved enough to avenge. The past could never be changed. Jonas would never return. The years of bondage could never be recovered. But the future was hers to write, and she was writing it one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of freedom at a time. In the ruins of Magnolia Hill Plantation, far away in Alabama, locals would tell stories for generations about the cook who poisoned the master and vanished into the woods. Some said she was hanged before dawn. Others swore she escaped and was never found. The truth, like so many truths, was more complicated than legend allowed. But Delilah didn't concern herself with those stories anymore. She was no longer defined by Magnolia Hill or by Master Thornhill's death. She was defined by the life she had built in freedom, by the love she shared with Samuel, by the children she was raising, by the community she had helped create. She had been a slave named Delilah who cooked at Magnolia Hill Plantation. She had been a mother who lost her son to injustice. She had been a woman who chose vengeance over submission. Now she was simply Delilah, free woman, restaurant owner, wife, mother, survivor. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.